1993. Bangkok International Airport. A young British woman walks slowly toward the departure gate, her face pale, her body weak. Inside her, hidden from sight, are just 89 grams of heroin. A small amount in weight, but in Thailand it carried a punishment far heavier than she could imagine. Sandra Gregory was not a hardened criminal, nor a mastermind in the global drug trade. She was a former English teacher, sick, broke, and desperate to return home. Yet in that single moment, she stepped into a world of consequences that would consume the next 7 years of her life. What drives a woman to take such a risk? Was it greed, or was it despair? To most, she looked like just another traveler, but authorities saw something else. Within hours, she would be handcuffed, interrogated, and sentenced under some of the harshest drug laws in the world. One decision, one desperate act, had set her on a path from freedom to infamy. Sandra Gregory grew up in West Yorkshire, in a setting that gave her a sense of stability and ambition. She was intelligent, adventurous, and like many young people of her generation, eager to see more of the world than the town she came from. After finishing her studies, she set out in search of new opportunities and experiences, and her path eventually led her to Thailand. At first, life there was everything she had hoped for. She settled into a community of friends, found work as an English teacher, and built a life for herself in a country that felt vibrant and full of possibility. For several years, she thrived. She had 2 teaching jobs, a busy social circle, and the freedom of independence in a place she had chosen for herself. But the same adventurous spirit that carried her there also left her vulnerable when her circumstances began to change. Her descent into desperation was triggered by illness. Gregory contracted dengue fever and later amoebic dysentery, both of which left her physically weakened and unable to continue working. In Thailand, without steady income, survival quickly became precarious. She lost her teaching positions, her financial safety collapsed, and her once secure life unraveled. The vibrant country that had once welcomed her became a place where she felt trapped. She longed to return home to Britain for treatment and recovery, but she had no savings left and no means of affording the journey. It was in this fragile state that a dangerous offer was presented to her. A man approached her with a proposition. If she carried drugs out of Thailand, she would be paid $1,000. To most, this would sound reckless, even unthinkable. But to Sandra Gregory, sick and desperate, it appeared as the only way out of her situation. She convinced herself it was a solution, quick money that would buy her a ticket home and a chance to escape the misery she was living in. The choice she made in that moment was not guided by ambition or greed, but by a sense of hopelessness. Yet it was enough to alter the course of her life forever. What she saw as an escape route was, in truth, a trap she would never fully escape. February 1993. Sandra Gregory arrived at Don Muang Airport in Bangkok, ready to board her flight home. She was weak from illness, her body still suffering the effects of dengue fever and dysentery. Alongside her was Robert Locke, a young man she had met during her time in Thailand. What looked like 2 ordinary travelers was, in reality, a smuggling attempt that would soon unravel. The package she carried inside her body weighed only 89 grams. A small amount, barely noticeable, yet enough to trigger the harshest consequences under Thai drug laws. As she approached the customs area, Gregory's nerves betrayed her. The anxiety, the strain, the fear. Something about her behavior caught the attention of security officers. She and Locke were stopped, questioned, and searched. Within moments, the truth surfaced. Authorities discovered the heroin, and both were immediately arrested. The atmosphere shifted from quiet suspicion to a nightmare that neither could escape. Gregory was dragged into interrogation, where the reality of her decision became clear. There would be no sympathy, no leniency, only the full weight of Thailand's justice system. Her trial began swiftly. In Thailand, the law was merciless. Drug smuggling was viewed as an attack on the nation. a crime that demanded severe punishment. Gregory confessed to her part in the crime, hoping honesty would lessen the outcome. Locke, too, was charged, though the circumstances of their involvement raised questions about who played the greater role. The verdict was crushing. Sandra Gregory was sentenced to death, a penalty that hung over her like a shadow. Though the sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment, the message was clear. Her desperate gamble had ended at the gates of one of the world's most unforgiving prison systems. What began as a plan to buy freedom had instead stolen it. In a single night, she moved from the departure lounge of an airport to the locked cells of a Thai prison. Her life forever changed. Sandra Gregory's arrest in Bangkok quickly moved into the courtroom, where the full force of Thailand's unforgiving drug laws came down on her. In the eyes of the Thai authorities, even small amounts of heroin were treated as a direct threat to society. Possession, trafficking, or smuggling, it made little difference. The punishment could be absolute. At the time, the death penalty was not just a possibility, but a common sentence for cases like hers. As Gregory stood trial, the severity of her situation became undeniable. The court listened as she admitted her role in carrying heroin out of the country. Her decision to plead guilty was not a strategy born of confidence but of fear. By confessing, she hoped to avoid the harshest outcome. That confession spared her from execution. Instead, the death sentence handed down was commuted, reduced to life in prison. Even then, the number that followed was staggering: 25 years. The weight of that sentence was almost as crushing as death itself. 25 years meant decades behind bars, years stolen from her youth, her health, and her freedom. For Sandra Gregory, the verdict was devastating. The idea of leaving prison in middle age, or possibly never walking free at all, felt like a punishment that stretched far beyond what she could bear. But the devastation was not hers alone. Back in Britain, her parents received the news with disbelief and heartbreak. Their daughter, once a bright and independent young woman, was now condemned to spend much of her life in one of the harshest prison systems in the world. The family's anguish grew heavier with the knowledge that their appeals and protests would carry little weight against Thailand's rigid laws. For Sandra Gregory, the trial marked the end of one life and the forced beginning of another. The door to freedom had closed. Ahead lay a reality defined not by the chance of escape, but by endurance, survival, and the faint hope that mercy might one day intervene. Sandra Gregory's sentence carried her through the gates of one of the most infamous prisons in Asia, the women's section of Bangkok's Klong Prem, known bitterly among inmates as the Bangkok Hilton. The name sounded almost glamorous, but inside its walls was a reality that stripped away all dignity. The first thing she faced was the crowding. A single cell could hold more than 170 women, crammed together with barely enough room to lie down. Privacy did not exist. Every movement, every sound was shared. The heat pressed down relentlessly, magnified by the crush of bodies, while the electric lights burned day and night, denying the prisoners even the comfort of darkness. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Toilets overflowed, the air was thick with stench, and disease spread easily in such close quarters. Basic hygiene became a daily battle, one that could not always be won. These conditions broke many women quickly, wearing away at their health and willpower. For Gregory, the emotional weight was as punishing as the physical discomfort. Days blurred into one another, marked not by time, but by survival. Hopelessness was always present, whispering that there would never be an end. Yet alongside despair grew an instinct to endure. Survival required shutting out fear, finding strength in small routines, and clinging to whatever fragments of dignity could be preserved. She adapted slowly, learning how to navigate the unspoken rules of prison life. Kindness could be a weakness, But cruelty was no protection either. Balance was necessary. To endure, she focused on acceptance, accepting the heat, the noise, the endless crowding. It was not resilience born of choice, but of necessity. In that world, freedom became an abstract dream, and survival was the only victory. Sandra Gregory learned to live not in years or months, but in single days, measured by endurance rather than hope. After 4.5 years in Thailand's notorious prisons, Sandra Gregory was given a chance at something different. In 1998, the International Prisoner Transfer Agreement allowed her to be moved back to the United Kingdom. On the surface, this seemed like salvation. A return to familiar soil, closer to her parents, away from the unbearable overcrowding and squalor of Bangkok's Klong Prem. But what awaited her in Britain would prove to be a new kind of torment, one that she would later describe as even worse than Thailand. Her first stop was Holloway Prison in London. Though harsh in its own right, Holloway at least carried a sense of proximity to home. Letters arrived more easily, visits were possible, and she was no longer an ocean away from her family. For the first time in years, she could hear English spoken all around her. Yet this thin layer of comfort was short-lived. Soon, she was transferred north to Durham Prison, and the nightmare deepened. Durham Prison was notorious in its own way. To Sandra, it felt colder, darker, and far more psychologically punishing than the Bangkok Hilton. The physical filth of Thailand was gone, but in its place was something more corrosive, the weight of isolation and the cruelty of her surroundings. She had left behind the unbearable heat and constant press of bodies. But in Durham she faced silence, loneliness, and the gnawing sensation of being buried alive within the system. Among the inmates was Rose West, one of Britain's most infamous female prisoners. Sharing the same institution with someone who had committed such horrors only reinforced the sense that Sandra's world had sunk to its lowest depths. Around her, violence simmered constantly. Prison fires broke out, spreading terror through the wings. Self-mutilation was common, a desperate outlet for women who could no longer bear the endless cycle of confinement. Sandra herself was not immune to the psychological toll. Isolation cut deeper than filth or overcrowding ever had. In Thailand, she had been crushed by bodies and noise, yet there was always the reminder of humanity around her. Other women, other voices. In Durham, she was left alone with her thoughts, her regrets, and the suffocating silence of English prison life. The monotony and despair were so great that she would later admit it was during this period that her spirit nearly broke. The irony was bitter. She had imagined that returning to her homeland would mean some form of mercy, some recognition of her struggle. Instead, she discovered that in many ways, the system at home could be even less forgiving than the one abroad. Thailand had punished her body, but Britain attacked her mind. Her parents' visits provided brief glimpses of comfort, but they could not erase the reality of her day-to-day existence. The prison corridors were haunted not just by criminals, but by the atmosphere of defeat, of lives cut short not by execution, but by endless years of despair. For Sandra Gregory, Durham became the darkest chapter of her imprisonment, a place where the hope she had managed to keep alive in Thailand was nearly extinguished. While Sandra Gregory endured the brutal conditions of prison, her parents fought a different battle back in Britain. They launched a tireless campaign for clemency, writing letters, appealing to officials, and begging the government to intervene on their daughter's behalf. To them, she was not simply a criminal condemned by Thai law, she was their child, broken, vulnerable, and in desperate need of mercy. But the response they received was cold, almost mechanical. The Foreign Office, the very institution meant to support British citizens abroad, repeatedly turned them away. In carefully worded letters, officials made it clear there were no compassionate grounds on which to act. every appeal was met with the same refusal. For Sandra's parents, this rejection was not only heartbreaking, but humiliating. They could see their daughter suffering, but the government seemed determined to stand aside. What deepened their pain was the knowledge that other British prisoners had been granted assistance in the past. Some received government support, even campaigns for release, while Sandra was left to face her ordeal alone. The contrast raised uncomfortable questions. Why was her case treated differently? Why did some lives merit intervention while hers did not? This sense of double standards began to stir public debate. Was justice truly being served, or was Sandra Gregory being abandoned by her own country? Newspapers reported on her situation, highlighting the inconsistency of official responses to Britons jailed abroad. The image of a young woman condemned to decades in foreign prisons, while her government chose silence, struck a raw nerve with the public. For Sandra's parents, the fight became about more than their daughter's release. It became a struggle against indifference, a plea for fairness, and a demand that their child's life not be weighed differently to others. But no matter how loud their voices grew, the official answer remained the same. There would be no intervention, no exception, no act of compassion. By the late 1990s, Sandra Gregory had already endured more than anyone could imagine. Years in Bangkok's Klong Prem prison, and later the unrelenting coldness of Durham. She had lived through physical degradation, mental torture, and the humiliation of being abandoned by her own government. Yet even as her parents campaigned tirelessly, as petitions were signed and voices raised, her fate remained in the hands of powers far beyond her reach. In Thailand, there was one source of hope for foreign prisoners like Sandra: the annual royal pardons granted by King Bhumibol Adulyadej. These pardons were rare, unpredictable, and dependent on factors no one outside the palace could fully understand. For years, Sandra's name was put forward alongside others. For years, her family waited by the phone, hoping for news that never seemed to come. Each silence cut deeper, as if time itself was erasing the chance of her ever walking free. But in 2000, everything changed. After 7 long years of confinement, Sandra Gregory's name was finally included on the King's pardon list. The news arrived suddenly, almost unbelievably, and it swept through her family like a storm of relief. For her parents, who had fought relentlessly and carried the unbearable weight of despair, the announcement was nothing short of a miracle. The release was not just a legal decision. It was an act of mercy that altered the course of a life. On hearing the words, Sandra herself was overwhelmed, after years of believing she might never breathe freely again. The idea of walking out of the prison gates was almost impossible to process. Her gratitude was immediate and profound. She understood that without the King's clemency, her life could have remained locked away for decades, or ended in a slow, crushing death inside the prison walls. The reunion with her family was emotional beyond words. Her parents, who had watched their daughter vanish into a nightmare, now held her again. The years lost could not be recovered. The scars could not be erased, but the weight of separation was finally lifted. To see Sandra free, alive, and returned to them was a gift they had once feared they would never receive. Yet freedom carried its own complicated emotions. Gratitude to the King was clear and deeply felt, but alongside it lingered devastation, the knowledge of everything that had been taken. 7 years of life, health, and dignity had been consumed by the punishment for one desperate mistake. The joy of release was therefore shadowed by the pain of memory. Sandra Gregory emerged from prison, not as the woman she had been in 1993, but as someone transformed by suffering. Her freedom was not simply a return to normal life. It was a reminder of how fragile life could be, how one decision could spiral into years of unimaginable consequence. She knew she owed her second chance to a foreign king rather than to her own government, a fact that added both irony and bitterness to her story. Still, the king's pardon gave her what no one else had offered: an end to the nightmare. It was an act of compassion that shifted her life from perpetual darkness back toward light. For Sandra, the royal clemency was more than just a release. It was proof that mercy, even delayed, could still rewrite destiny. Freedom did not mean the end of Sandra Gregory's struggles. Once back in Britain, she was confronted with a new challenge: rebuilding a life that had been shattered by years behind bars. Ordinary routines, things most people took for granted, felt unfamiliar after nearly a decade of confinement. She tried to regain some sense of normalcy, but the past refused to loosen its grip. To make sense of her experiences and to tell her side of the story, Sandra turned to writing. In 2002, she published her memoir, Forget You Ever Had a Daughter. The title alone carried the weight of her suffering, reflecting not only the pain she endured, but also the emotional distance prison had forced between her and her family. In its pages, she described in unflinching detail the horrors of Thai jails, the despair of isolation in Britain, and the long years of waiting for freedom. Yet sharing her story did not free her from judgment. For many, she remained a woman who had once smuggled heroin, a crime that overshadowed the human cost she had already paid. The stigma clung to her, following her into every attempt at work, relationships, and social acceptance. Redemption, it seemed, was far harder to win in the eyes of the public than in the hands of the Thai king. Sandra herself reflected often on the irony of her journey. The Thai prison, brutal as it was, offered a strange sense of community and survival. The British prison system, on the other hand, left her isolated, marked by violence, and surrounded by some of the most notorious criminals in the country. Both systems punished her, but in entirely different ways, one by crushing the body, the other by suffocating the spirit. Her life after release was a constant balancing act between gratitude and grief, between the chance to live freely again and the shadow of everything that could never be reclaimed. Through her writing, Sandra preserved not just her story, but also her scars, ensuring that the lessons of her ordeal would not be forgotten. Sandra Gregory's ordeal was not just a personal tragedy, it was a stark reminder of the risks faced by those who become drug mules. Her story highlighted how one reckless decision could lead to years of suffering in the world's harshest prisons. The lure of quick money has trapped countless others, yet the price paid is always far greater than the reward. Her case was not unique. Over the years, many Britons have found themselves jailed abroad for similar crimes, each one discovering too late that foreign justice shows no leniency. Once arrested, there is little room for mercy. Courts in countries like Thailand treat drug trafficking as one of the most serious offenses, and punishment is delivered with uncompromising severity. The British government has consistently maintained its stance. Citizens abroad are subject to the laws of the country they are in. The Foreign Office can provide consular assistance, but it will not interfere with another nation's legal system. For families hoping for government intervention, this reality has often come as a devastating blow. Gregory's case continues to echo as a warning. It illustrates not only the personal cost of smuggling, but also the limits of protection once outside Britain's borders. For many, her story has served as a lesson passed down through generations. Don't believe that desperation or youth will shield you from consequences. The broader message is clear. No matter how dire the circumstances, taking such risks is a gamble that destroys lives, not just for those caught, but for their families as well. Sandra Gregory's years of imprisonment stand as a cautionary tale, a story meant to deter others from making the same irreversible mistake.